and gentlemen, welcome to the monthly Animal Behavior and Welfare Seminar series of the Confound Center for the Study of Animal Behavior and Welfare. My name is Alexandra Hollander, and I'm Assistant Professor at the Animal Biosciences Department. And I'm talking to you in my capacity as program organizer. And today, we are very delighted. We have a very special guest with us, Dr. Gary Varner. And Dr. Varner has a bachelor degree in philosophy from Arizona State University and a master in philosophy from the University of Georgia and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he has a research interest in animal welfare and animal rights philosophy and environmental ethics and law. And today, we will give a talk about the utilitarian perspective on companion animals. The floor is now yours.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was sick for several weeks with a bad congestion and so on, and I have a lingering cough from it, so I'm going to apologize in advance if I break out in a terrible coughing fit. Now, we had a little issue here with setting up the equipment, and so I don't see my notes. In fact, shall I try to find them? Maybe I shouldn't. No, I'll just wing it. So my topic is a utilitarian perspective on companion animals, and what's informing this talk are 4 pieces of work, 2 of which are in print and 2 of which are in progress. I was invited to give a paper, or write a paper for a forthcoming anthology on companion animals under this topic, a utilitarian perspective on them, because I previously published a paper in another anthology in 2002 titled Pets, Companion Animals, and Domesticated Partners, and I'll introduce that distinction as I make it in this talk today. The other paper, the paper that's forthcoming, is actually called A Two-Level Utilitarian Perspective on Companion Animals, and it's forthcoming in that volume, Pets and People. And you'll understand why I qualify it by saying a 2-level utilitarian perspective as we proceed. I was invited to contribute that paper to the forthcoming anthology because I previously published a book titled Personhood, Ethics, and Animal Cognition, Situating Animals in the Two-Level Utilitarianism of R.M. Hare. And I have a sequel to that in progress, which will be titled Sustaining Animals, Envisioning Humane Sustainable Communities. And although the first book that's in print already doesn't say anything about pets, the second book will incorporate my thinking on them that I'm going to summarize today. And that's still in progress, not even in galley form or anything yet. So any feedback I have during this presentation from you and in our subsequent discussions this afternoon could improve the work that I do. Well, what I'm going to do in the presentation today is 4 things. Describe what 2-level utilitarianism is, very briefly. Give those 3 categories, definitions of those 3 categories of pets that I mentioned earlier. Give my reasons for thinking that pet keeping is justifiable in utilitarian terms, and then close with looking at some different strategies for improving our relationships with pets from the perspective of this 2-level view that emphasizes the distinction among laws, codes of professional ethics, and what I'll call common morality. So to move to the first topic, to describe 2-level utilitarianism, utilitarianism gets some bad press. It's there's a deprecating sense in which you say, well, that's a very utilitarian truck that you're driving there, Gary, which means something like, well, you know, it works, but it's not comfortable. Of course, that's not the sense that philosophers have in mind when they think about utilitarianism. The OED also includes this characterization of principles or a philosophy that regards the greatest good or happiness of the greatest number as the chief consideration or rule of morality. And in that philosophical sense, utilitarianism is often summarily dismissed using certain kinds of counterexamples, because the thought is, well, sometimes, under some circumstances, what would cause the greatest good for the greatest number would be enslaving a very small portion of the population for the sake of benefiting a whole bunch of people. Or they'll say things like, well, if you think of it in terms of doing whatever, if you think of it in terms of being the view that what's right is whatever will maximize aggregate happiness under the circumstances, lots of times lying might maximize aggregate happiness, punishing the innocent, all these favorite famous counterexamples to utilitarianism. And the 2-level view is designed to in part to address those. And I like to summarize utilitarianism in exactly these words, that it's the view that you should arrange things so as to maximize aggregate happiness. And the arrange things, there is a subtle change in wording, but it's significant, because what I'm going to say is that if you're a convinced utilitarian, you actually have good reasons for arranging things so that you don't think like a utilitarian all the time. And that's the origin of this two-level view. I think a good way to introduce the two-level view is to contrast it with what philosophers often call act utilitarianism, the view that the right thing to do is, under any circumstances that you happen to find yourself in, ask yourself, what would maximize aggregate happiness if I did it here? And that's where you end up doing things like punishing the innocent under some circumstances and so on. But to introduce why a utilitarian has reason not to think like a utilitarian much of the time, I think it's good to talk in terms of an analogy with what I'll characterize as act ethical egoism. So suppose I took a philosophy class in my freshman year, and I became rationally convinced that the right thing to do is whatever will maximize my own happiness under the circumstances. I think I would pretty quickly argue myself out of going around thinking like that all the time, because most people say that selfless, loving relationships are among the greatest goods that people enjoy, and that contribute in a very significant way to human happiness. So if I literally walked around thinking like that, calculating constantly what was going to be in my own best interests, I'd miss out on some of the best goods or best contributions to human happiness that are available. Well, similarly, if I walked around thinking consciously, calculating what was going to maximize aggregate happiness, as the utilitarian does, it's kind of like a generalization of the egoist view, but saying, let's do what's best for everybody affected on average or on the whole. But if I went around calculating like that, I don't think I'd make a very good friend, lover, or companion animal keeper, frankly. So a utilitarian, an ethical egoist, to go back to the one-person scenario, would quickly convince themselves that they shouldn't always walk around calculating about what's going to maximize their own self-interest. Their general critical level principle might be something like arrange things so that my own happiness will be maximized. But in order to achieve that, you'd want to train yourself to act in accordance with what I'll label intuitive level system rules, which would roughly include something like, don't think like an egoist all the time. Put your loved one's interest above your own, things like that. The two-level utilitarian view is a direct analog of this. The utilitarian's going to miss out on some of the best goods in human life if they're consciously calculating like a utilitarian all the time. So they should instead say that, well, my general view is I'm going to arrange things so that I can maximize aggregate happiness over time. Part of that's going to involve not thinking like a utilitarian explicitly all the time, because I'd miss out on all kinds of things, and that contribution to aggregate happiness would be lost. Now, there are several reasons that utilitarians need what I'm calling intuitive level rules. So the idea is you have a two-level system. Utilitarianism is the driving background principle, but it drives you to arrange things so that you have internalized certain intuitive level rules that you act sort of habitually according to. You act, judge, and so on consistently with them. And one of the reasons for needing those is the one I just gave. And by the way, R.M. Hare, the utilitarian that I've started my work from and kind of organized my thinking around, never mentions that reason for not thinking like a utilitarian all the time. He gives some other reasons, though. For instance, that in various circumstances, extremely detailed information would be required to accurately apply the principle of utility and figure out with certainty what's going to maximize aggregate happiness. Another one is that even if you had access to all the data, sometimes it's extremely complex, and humans, just real-world flesh and blood humans, have limited data processing abilities and make mistakes. And finally, there's a fourth reason that Hare does emphasize a lot, and that is there's a tendency for us to cook the data, convince ourselves incorrectly, it turns out, that doing what we happen to find in our own interests, or what we happen to want to do, is also going to maximize happiness. Hare refers to that as cooking the data in favor of self-interest. And for this combination of reasons, then, what we should do as utilitarians is think, how could we arrange things so that we avoid these kinds of problems that would arise if we went around consciously calculating as a utilitarian all the time? And Hare, oh, by the way, here's another slide to illustrate. I use the expression internalize these rules so that they're sort of a moral autopilot. Hare emphasizes that in order to guard against cooking the data in favor of self-interest, the intuitive level rules have to be internalized in such a way that you're diffident or, hesitant to violate them. And even, he says, so that when under extreme circumstances you do calculate like a utilitarian and think that you're probably justified in violating even a very important rule, it should still look to you intuitively as if what you did was wrong. He says if you haven't internalized the rule in that deep way so that it's this moral autopilot, then it's not going to work to guard against cooking the data. And the corridor illusion is a good illustration of this. There are various cases in human processing, cognitive processing of various kinds, where there's an output of an intuitive, fast-acting system, the visual system, that gives you the impression that the upper figure is actually taller than the bottom figure. And the way I think I should put it is, it looks like it occupies slightly more space on the screen. But if you go up there with a measure and measure it down to the 0.5 millimeter, they are exactly the same size. Measuring to the millimeter is like explicitly calculating as a utilitarian. But the result of deciding, okay, they're actually the same size, doesn't make them not look the same, or it doesn't make them, oh, I'm sorry, I said it backwards, yeah. The result of calculating is they're exactly the same size. But they still look to the output of your intuitive visual system. They look different sizes. That's the way you're supposed to, according to Hare, internalize these intuitive level rules. Now, Hare does not use this acronym, but I like the acronym ILS for Intuitive Level System Rules. And I like it because in aviation, ILS stands for Instrument Landing System, which allows you to line up with your approach to the airport, to the runway, and match your descent in the right way so that you can land safely, even when you can't see the runway coming until you're right on top of it. It's also nice to just have a nice handy acronym of ILS instead of saying Intuitive Level System Rules. So from here on, I'm going to refer to ILS rules, and that's what I mean. Hare emphasizes that there are at least 3 different kinds of these things. The laws of a legal system can be seen as an intuitive level system. If you imagine a legislature full of utilitarians, they might for various reasons think, we should pass certain laws and punish people for not obeying them because on the whole things will work better and society will function better. So that's how a utilitarian would view laws in this 2-level system, is as a species, as it were, of intuitive level rule. Codes of professional ethics are another category. Difference between laws and codes of professional ethics is that codes of professional ethics are only apply to a subset of the whole population, whereas laws apply to everybody. Then there's what I call common morality, and by this I mean some set of norms that a group or subgroup of society agree on, and that are a sort of set of background agreements that they can all count on each other agreeing to with regard to various practices and so on. There's a bunch of mushiness and complication there, because how do you identify a group or a subgroup that has a uniform set of norms that they do in fact agree to? I admit that it's a mushy thing. It's also mushy in the following way. Laws and codes of professional ethics are both written down somewhere, and there are formal processes for amending them over time. With regard to common morality, there's no formal process for amending it. And worse yet, I think with regard to some of our common sense moral commitments, like the commitment to keeping promises, for instance, I don't think you can even specify precisely in words what our shared understanding about that rule is. Any way you write it out, you're going to be able to think of some possible situations that wouldn't quite be covered by the rule. And it seems like that in that part of our moral thinking, humans' moral judgment is more like the judgment that a connectionist system would make if it has been trained up on examples over time of a 6 versus a 2 written on a page, for instance, but never programmed with any explicit rule to follow. Such a system over time, learning from paradigm cases, internalizes what's sometimes called a paradigm space that causes it to make the same discriminations between 2s and 6s that a human would. But again, without anybody being able to write down an exact rule that it's following. I think our common morality is often like that, and so there's no formal process for amending it. And this will be significant in some of what I want to say later on. I'd also emphasize that I think that if you're a utilitarian, you're committed at the intuitive level to a kind of pragmatism, and that is that every generation finds itself having inherited a set of laws, a set of professional ethics for different subsets of the society, and a common morality from the past. And if you're trying to do your best in the murky real world as a utilitarian, you have to ask yourself every generation, what did we inherit from the past, and how can we tweak those things in various ways to try to improve the degree to which we're maximizing aggregate happiness as a society? So now, on to the second point, and this is going to be purely stipulative. I published that essay titled Pets, Companion Animals, and Domesticated Partners. So what I'm going to do here is just give you definitions of those terms as I define them. There's the background question of what is a pet, versus what I'll call a mere pet. I don't have anything novel to say about our general concept of a pet. I think that Barbara Barnbaum, in a 1998 essay in, of all places, the Journal of Philosophy for Children, hit the nail pretty much on the head. And so I'll just quickly relate her criteria for something counting as a pet. A pet is, the pet keeper feels affection for it, although not necessarily vice versa. The pet leads a very different kind of life than its keeper, so you can't keep a human and have it qualify as a pet. A pet lives in an area significantly under the keeper's control, so when I feed a raccoon in the backyard, that doesn't count as a pet because I don't have some kind of substantial control over it. Although if I have a horse in a barn somewhere else that I go and work with, that still counts as an area under my control. And finally, a pet depends on its keeper to have various important needs met. She thinks that these rule out Tamagotchis, that old silly toy, counting as pets, and a bunch of other cases that we would all say, no, come on, that's not really a pet, a rock, for instance, or something like that. So given that that's our kind of general conception of a pet, I want to distinguish three categories within that class of pets. And the first is, this one won't seem surprising at all. This is just my own way of kind of summarizing what I think our common sense notion of a companion animal is. It's a pet, by Barnbaum's criteria, that receives affection and care from the owner and also has significant social interaction with its owner and would voluntarily choose to stay with the owner in part for the sake of that companionship. Big accordion term in there, right? Would voluntarily choose to stay with the owner. You can think of examples in human relationships where someone, in scare quotes, voluntarily wants to stay with their partner, but from the outside we see that it's a dysfunctional relationship. I admit that's a problem. I don't have anything definitive to say about that, but for our purposes, I hope that I can get by with the kind of general notion of a pet that wants to stay with the owner because it enjoys the companionship with them would safely qualify as a companion animal. There may be cases that we want to dispute about, but that's the general idea. Now, what about a domesticated partner? Now, this is pretty stipulative of me. It's a companion animal, pet, that works with humans in ways that emphasize and exercise the pet's mental and or physical faculties in a healthy way. Again, a difficult phrase in here is works in ways that that are healthy for it. You could think of complex working relationships that end up not being healthy for the animal, even though the animal seems to enjoy it or something. But my idea here is to map out a category where if it's not such a problematic example, we would agree that this is a companionship relationship that's much more nuanced and dedicated and specific than companion animals that don't count as domesticated partners, that don't have that sophisticated working relationship with their humans. And then finally, the other term I'll introduce is a mere pet, by which I mean something that qualifies as a pet, but doesn't seem to qualify as either a companion animal or a domesticated partner. Now, I introduce these terms not just because, as a friend of mine likes to joke, what does a philosopher do in an emergency? He makes a distinction. So philosophers are fond of making distinctions and giving stipulative definitions, but I like to use these categories in talking about ways in which pet keeping can be justifiable from a utilitarian perspective. And here, this is why I can't see my notes, okay. I wanted first, though, to give you some examples of what I think count as domesticated partners. So it seems to me that working dogs of various kinds count as domesticated partners, and not surprisingly, because dogs have been domesticated for thousands of years, and during that time have worked in very complicated ways with herding, more recent, and as beasts of burden, and then more recently as search and rescue dogs and military dogs. But also there are dogs that seem to me to qualify very clearly. I think they're paradigm examples of domesticated partnerships that aren't involved in work, and agility course work with dogs seems to me like a good example of an enriched relationship between an owner and the pet that I think clearly would qualify as more than just a companion animal. It's a domesticated partnership you got going there.
Can you qualify as both?
Do what?
Can you qualify as both domestic partner and?
Yeah, actually the way I defined it, I said a domesticated partner is a companion animal that does this other more sophisticated stuff. And that leads to the following objection from some people. They'll say, well, wait a minute, there might be certain working dogs that seem to fit the domesticated partner model, except that they're not really companion animals because the person who works with them doesn't like them or something like that. I admitted at the beginning that I was stipulating these definitions and there were some woolly edges around them. It's more what I want to talk in terms of in the justifiability of pet keeping is the paradigm clear cases of them. So I'm talking, but when I say domesticated partner, I mean a dog that works with a human and they really like each other. And thanks for that clarification, by the way. Horses, it seems to me the other species that comes directly to mind when I think, well, what are some examples of domesticated partners that humans have? And horses seem like the other really, really clear example. By the way, barrel racing is my favorite rodeo sport, and I'm not sure I like any other rodeo sport, but barrel racing looks to me like, you couldn't do that if you weren't really working together. Oh, there is one interesting comment I want to make about cutting horse competitions. Cutting horses, you couldn't get the animal to perform up to competition level in a cutting horse competition if you didn't have this really sophisticated working relationship with it. But it strikes me when I watch cutting horses perform that, by the time they're in the ring, the rider's role is just to select which animal the horse is going to cut, and then they're just along for the ride, literally, after that. So it's a really interesting relationship in that case. A pretty clear case of animals that are commonly count as companion animals by my conception, but are rarely domesticated partners would be cats. And by the way, in the upper left there is my feral cat, Maggie, and in the bottom right, the bucket of kittens there are the kittens she gave birth to a couple of weeks after I trapped the feral cat in my house. More on that later, perhaps, but however, I actually wanted to show a video as you were walking in of the acrocats performing on Colbert. Did anybody see this? A couple of people did. They didn't perform 100% accurately, let's say. But what they get those cats to do convinces me that if you're sensitive about it, you can develop a full-blown domesticated partnership, kind of the analog of an agility course for cats. And it seems to me that even average cat owners like myself can do basic things like teach cats to come on command, to go into a carrier to eat, to respond, to desist when told no, things like that. That might not be a full-blown domesticated partnership, but it's kind of moving in that direction from someone who just has the cat in the house and it comes and cuddles and that's the end of it. And it doesn't stop when they say no and it can't come on command and so on. How about mere pets? Herpetofauna, reptiles and amphibians, seem to me, given my experience, animals that can be pets, but I'm not sure I've known any cases of them really qualifying as companion animals. More so when it comes to invertebrates and fish, although I've had some people think that their fish were responsive to them in certain ways. And I had someone who told me he kept a slug as a pet as a kid, but I really don't think that was ripe for a companion animal relationship. So these are some what I take to be paradigm examples of mere pets on the one hand, companion animals, and then domesticated partners on the other. How would you justify keeping pets falling under those three definitions if you're thinking in explicitly utilitarian terms about the institution of pet keeping? Should we allow it in the law and other categories of ILS rules that I introduced earlier? Well, it seems to me that it is justifiable. Not to say that the institution as we have it now is perfectly justified and needing to be modified in various ways, but at least some forms of pet ownership seem to me completely justifiable in utilitarian terms, and three empirical considerations inspire me to that conclusion. One is that there's some evidence, although the evidence is a bit ambiguous, that keeping pets, even mere pets, improves the health of human beings, psychologically and in terms of physical health. The evidence is somewhat ambiguous, but and so I can't say that the question is settled, but it seems to me that it's likely that there are benefits that we get from having pets, even mere pets. Secondly, if a pet meets my stipulative definition of a companion animal, it's written right in there, right, that it wants to stay with you. Because there can be dysfunctional relationships, that's not a definitive proof that it's getting something out of the relationship, that it's enjoying it too, but it's at least prima facie evidence that the animal is benefiting from the relationship as well. And then finally, for pets that meet my stipulative definition of a domesticated partner, behavioral problems, which are definitely the leading cause of strife in humans' relationships with pets, can be controlled more effectively. And also, it seems to me that humans' relationships with them tend to be more satisfying than our relationships with companion animals. I'm not claiming that I have empirical proof of that. It sounds right to me, based on my experience and watching other people with various animals. I don't claim that it's proven empirically, and I don't claim that it's a categorical truth, but it seems likely to me that if I have a companion animal and I develop a more sophisticated relationship, like a domesticated partnership, approximating it at least, it's going to be better for me and the pet. So the conclusions I draw are that the practice of pet keeping is justifiable from a utilitarian perspective. Although keeping mere pets may sometimes be a good thing, it's generally better to keep a companion animal rather than a mere pet. And not surprisingly, it's generally good for pet keepers to develop, to the extent practicable, a domesticated partnership with their companion animals. And in explicitly utilitarian terms, philosophers don't get to draw graphs very much. So these slides may not be necessary, but I took time to learn to draw a graph for the first time. So I'm going to impose them on you. So here's, so for keeping it simple, suppose you just have one person. I live alone in terms of human companionship alone. And there I am, and let's arbitrarily assign me some utility level, happiness level of 10 units. Well, if I were just looking at the situation, my situation in isolation, then the aggregate utility is just my utility of 10. But if I bring even a mere pet into the house, and the mere pet is living a life that's at least as good or better than it would have lived in the wild, then it's benefiting, it's increasing the aggregate happiness in the household. And also, remember we said that even mere pets make individual owners better off. So watch the smile. Oops, what happened? Oh, I hit the wrong button. There we go. The smile got bigger, see? And that means that aggregate utility is further increased by having the companion animal. But now if a mere pet. But now if I add a companion animal to the household, it seems to me that the companion animal probably lives a richer, more happy life, usually, than a mere pet does, because they're outright enjoying the companionship of their human. And also, this is my speculation, I can't prove this empirically, but it seems to me probably companion animals benefit us psychologically as humans and physically as humans a little bit more than mere pets. And then same thing with if I develop a domesticated partnership, if my speculation earlier about the quality of human relationships being enhanced for the human and the animal that is nurtured into this domesticated partnership, then the utility is even further heightened. So those, graphically speaking, those are my reasons for thinking that pet keeping is justified with the qualifications about mere pets versus companion animals versus domesticated partners. Now I move on to the final point, which is strategies for improving our relationships with pets. Within a two-level utilitarian system, remember there are discrete types of ILS or intuitive level rules, laws, professional ethics, and common morality. So I want to give an example of within each category, at least one example of how a utilitarian, doing explicitly utilitarian thinking now, about how to modify those ILS rules that you've inherited from previous generations to improve, from a utilitarian perspective, our institution of pet keeping as we've inherited it. Well, there are those three categories, remember, and then there's the type of pragmatism where you take those that you've inherited, laws and other kinds of intuitive level system rules, and you have to ask yourself, realistically, how much good can we accomplish in our lifetimes having inherited the laws and the common morality and so on that we have from the past? What are the strategies that are most likely to pay off and us be able to put into practice to improve the institution? Well, with regard to changing our laws regarding pets, a really simple suggestion for thinking about a legal framework is given in a nice essay by David Fraser and Catherine, I think it is, Shupley, back in 2000, titled A Framework for Assessing the Suitability of Different Species as Companion Animals. And what they did was give a list of 12 questions that they thought legislators in the community should ask themselves or ask a panel of experts. And they had to do with things like how difficult to manage and meet the needs of the animal was in terms of meeting its needs well, procurement issues about where the source of the pets were coming from, and other environmental issues that might be raised by having the species of animal in the domestic setting and the kind of things that can go wrong. And so they suggest that basically legislators either themselves or ask a panel of experts to try to categorize animals reasonably in their best judgment into 5 categories. And the first is needs are easily met. 2 examples that they give that they think fall into this category would be mice and hamsters. Category B was, well, it requires significant time, but the needs are still fairly easily met by the average person if they put the time in. And not surprisingly there, they categorize dogs and cats, most cases of dogs and cats in that category. Category 3 is animals that have complex or demanding requirements needing skillful and knowledgeable owners. And the 2 examples they give here are falconry on the one hand, keeping falcons, and green iguanas on the other. They then have a final category of unsuitable as companion animals. And here they give us their explicit examples, snakes and large cats, not domesticated cats. And then they allude to, well, there may be some dog breeds that fall into this category. They didn't mention a breed by name, and I intentionally did not put a pit bull up there because I knew that somebody would say, you've got that wrong, man, they're misunderstood. So I just put a caricature of a vicious dog over there. The missing category D, by the way, is throw up our hands. We don't know enough about the species to make a judgment about whether to put it in A, B, C, or E. And the idea then is this is a framework for a legislature having inherited a set of laws governing pets and thinking about how to tweak them. So they say, for instance, a community might decide to make it illegal to keep animals listed in category E, or they might require for C and or E, the kinds of things that, the special regulations that apply to falconry, at least in the United States, where you have to demonstrate that you have a certain kind of training and you even have to be inspected by authorities. So it's a flexible framework for taking laws, tinkering with them, and this can be seen from a utilitarian perspective as a way of modifying our ILS rules to try to improve the institution of pet keeping. Now, what about codes of professional ethics? It seems to me that standards of organizations like the American Kennel Club and the Canadian Kennel Club are sufficiently analogous to codes of professional ethics to kind of put them in this category when we're thinking as a 2-level utilitarian. They're explicitly written down, breed standards, for instance, and there are presumably some kind of formal mechanisms that would have to be used to amend them over time. Ear cropping and tail docking are still included in the breed standards of both the American and Canadian kennel clubs, despite the fact that the AVMA, as far back as 1976, recommended that breed associations remove those requirements. And the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association also opposes it, although I didn't look far enough to find out how far back it might have been doing this. Notice that the AVMA has been recommending this in repeated policy statements from 1976 until the present, which raises that question about the pragmatism of a pragmatist bent. There are some things that realistically you're not sure you're going to be able to get changed in the near term, but there's a richer version of that story that I want to give in a second when I get to the notion of common morality. But with regard to breed standards, you could expect, you could advocate for organizations changing those standards, even if so far it hasn't worked. Part of the problems with breed standards are that the associations maintain closed stud books so that you don't get new genetic input, which of course has led over time, as some of these stud books have been closed for over 100 years, to breeds with congenital health problems. And here I did pick a particular breed because my sense is that as it were, whipping boy when it comes to problem breeds because of genetic issues is the English bulldog. And you see about 100 years ago, an example on the left versus now on the right. And that drawing, it's not an actual X-ray, obviously, of the skulls, demonstrates to what extent the preferences of breeders and showers and the judges, crucially in showing contests, have caused indirectly in the malformation of the skull and jaw, which are accompanied by a range of health problems, and I'm sure you people in the room know far better than I do. And I wanted to quote here the CVMA in particular because I liked their policy statement on this issue. They said, we're concerned about breeding dogs with a known or highly suspect genetic predisposition to inherited disorders. The CVMA is also concerned about the continuation of breeds whose structure and characteristics inherently cause health problems. I just think that's an especially explicit stand that they've taken trying to influence the kennel clubs. So, also under the general heading of changing codes of professional ethics, I want to suggest somebody taking a risk on developing and trademarking. I have not trademarked certified companion bred dog. I just put it there for dramatic effect. My idea here is for an organization like a Humane Society of Canada or the United States or something, doing the following and copywriting the label. Take an initial population of animals who all score well on established, currently used tests of health issues, behavioral issues, including non-aggression and trainability, and then take those animals and breed them, and then test all of their offspring in the next generation and do the same thing, repeating with only the dogs who score highest in each generation. I'm inspired here partly by that famous experiment in Russia with silver foxes, where tame silver foxes were produced within only about 8 or 10 generations. So in a short period of time, you can cause a lot of morphological and health-related and behavioral changes. And so my idea here is that if you trademarked this label and you establish this line where you know that if you get an animal that's certified companion bred, it's going to be a great dog, relatively easy to develop what I call a domesticated partnership with. Now you have to luck out and get publicity, because you have to have it catch on and become something trendy. But the reason I think this is such a cool idea, and one of the main reasons, is that if you did establish this new breed standard that the HUS or Canadian Humane Society would organize and have the trademark on, it could provide a new example of what a good breed of dog is. Now, I had trouble choosing a picture here because I wanted just a bunch of mutts who looked very different. These look a little too close to certain breeds that even I know something about, but the idea behind this picture is a certified companion bred dog wouldn't necessarily look a certain way. And it would provide, if that caught on and got popular, a new idea, a new paradigm of what a good breed of dog is that has nothing to do with how it looks and whether or not it resembles an ancestral archetype, for instance. And that could be a cool thing. Okay. Now, what about our common morality? I admitted when I introduced this notion that, sometimes the standards, the norms of common morality can't even be precisely articulated by those of us who have internalized them. And also, for present purposes, there's no, official written down version of it, and there's no, community congress at which we say, okay, let's talk about how to change those standards. So it's admittedly a murky, messy area, but I want to emphasize how important it can be, because it seems to me that changes in our common morality often have greater potential for affecting changes than do changes in the laws and codes of professional ethics. And I can give an example with regard to the breed standards, with regard to tail docking and ear clipping. The AVMA has been recommending that those be removed from breed standards since 1976, as I emphasized. But if a generation from now, our common shared norms had evolved to a point where almost nobody thought it was acceptable to do those things for purely cosmetic reasons, you wouldn't have to ask the AKC and the CKC to remove those from the breeding standards. They would have done it. And that's an illustration of how, in some circumstances, changes in common morality can have profound influence and can make things change faster than the law or a professional organization like a kennel club can. But admittedly, it's difficult to understand why and how those kinds of changes in common morality occur. Here is an illustration of a dramatic change that occurred in the last generation on attitudes towards same-sex marriage. If I think about the attitudes in today and compare them to my parents when they were young, it's completely inverted. So a dramatic change in our common morality appears to have occurred with regard to same-sex marriage in something like a generation. It's really hard to say exactly what caused it. Everybody says about this example, you know, it happened, but we can't nail down how it happened. Clearly, one factor is celebrities who come out as being gay, and also people increasingly across time as more people in everyday life come out as being gay, that we increasingly realize, boy, I've known people my whole life who are gay, and it's fine. And so in those subtle ways, attitudes change, and they can have dramatic impacts. Now, since we're talking about animals and pets and domesticated partners here, think of the so-called blackfish effect. A movie, after it was run on CNN about every hour and a half for a couple of years, appears to have been a catalyst, you know, a crucial little agent of change with regard to SeaWorld's policies towards orcas. And I want to mention, although I don't want to put too much stress on this, that I hope that public intellectuals, including, for instance, some philosophers, can sometimes have this kind of nudging effect and catalyst effect on our shared common morality. The best example is probably Peter Singer's work. That book has been enormously influential. It's dissed to some extent by professional philosophers, by academic philosophers, but it's an example of a philosopher doing what philosophers do, writing the way we write, publishing a book that, like the movie and like public personality, can exert a subtle, difficult to specify, but profound influence on our common morality. By the way, I don't think that my work is going to have that effect. I just want to say philosophers aren't entirely useless. So the influences, surely, as illustrated by my examples there, include things like literature, film, television, and art, celebrities, authorities, public intellectuals, discussions, political discussions in the media, but also around the kitchen table. I mean, you know, the dinner table. And I also want to add here, though, in the last line there, that examples are set by everyday people. And what I have in mind there is that, you know, look, if you're not somebody who's in a position to have a profound influence on the general public, you can still have a subtle but maybe significant influence on the people who know you, to the extent that you work with your dog in a sophisticated way, or maybe you try to work with your feral cat, training it in various ways. And that can exercise a subtle influence on what the community over time thinks about. It can set a model for others to emulate to some extent. I don't want to, you know, dress this up too much or emphasize it too much, but I think it's a factor there. And so I've talked about these 4 topics, and I'll stop now. I have no idea what the time is because, oh, and there's a clock up there.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. The talk is now open for discussion. Are there any questions? Do you agree or disagree with Gary? Are there any questions? Yes, please.
I have a question. So in your category about different pets, I think you were talking about those animals who qualify because of their potential to fall into a category, not those animals that you commonly use for a certain category, right?
Yes and no. I mean, I gave you the category of dogs and said they're, you know, well suited to becoming domesticated partners. But what I really mean to do is point to concrete individual cases and say, look, that seems like a paradigm example of a domesticated partner. A lot of them that you point to, that I would point to, turn out to be dogs and turn out to be horses.
Yeah. So in the category of domesticated partners, mostly it's probably dogs here in our Western culture, but maybe even pigs would qualify for that because people keep pot-bellied pigs and so on. They're trainable, they're adaptable, they make very good pets, companions, and so on.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on
Yeah.
technical implications of that? You know, that a dog is also can fall into the category of domesticated partner, but it can also fall in the category of meat.
Right. Well, you raised several separate issues there. On the one hand, speaking strictly of pets, if I had my notes to glance at as I was going through, I would have seen a prompt to myself to say, by no means am I convinced that the only species that are well suited to becoming domesticated partners are dogs and horses. And examples that I wanted to allude to included parrots, say, for instance. I didn't think of pigs, but pigs are known to be trainable. And although in our society, you don't know a neighbor who is setting an example of keeping a pig and trying to develop something like a domesticated partnership with it, but that's not impossible. And if our culture were different, we might keep pigs as pets and eat dogs, for instance. Now, the separate issue you raise, as you said, the ethical issue of here's one species that could be a domesticated partner and a good companion animal, pot-bellied pigs perhaps, but we eat pigs in America. Well, with dogs, you can find cultures today that eat dogs, and you can buy them live in the market, as I understand. These things certainly vary across cultures, and this illustrates the point I made there about a kind of pragmatism in the utilitarian way of thinking. If I found myself in a culture that had a centuries-long tradition of eating dogs, and I wanted to effect change before I died, there might be better ways of doing it than me just campaigning for the abolition of dogs as food. You can imagine an analogous movement in America. How much good publicity do you think, well, I mean, we have concrete examples, PETA, for instance. How much, a group with a message that is so far removed from the common sense morality of their culture at the time is not likely to really get changes effected. It's the more moderate groups that get the real changes effected. But that also inspires me to add another thing about this amorphous process by which our common morality changes over time. I really think that in a society like ours, there's a role for both kinds of groups. So you've got a group out there advocating for things that are far removed from the common sense morality of their generation in that culture. But those movements can have effect down the range in the future when the common morality has evolved or developed to a certain extent where it might be more feasible to affect changes that they're imagining affecting now. And I guess the thing I want to emphasize at the end of this response to you is, I did say, well, utilitarians should have a pragmatist bent. Like, you really want to think, what's the most effective strategy for getting bang for our buck, as it were, for improving conditions for animals that we can hope to affect during our lifetimes. But in saying that and emphasizing it earlier on, I do want to add the qualification that I think there's also a role in the larger scope process for more radical groups advocating for more idealistic changes.
Yes, please.
So my question, thank you for your talk, by the way.
Sure.
My question more specifically with the ethical framework you're working with in the two levels.
Uh-huh.
So you have the intuitive level systems where that's like our inherent laws, that's our common idea is of what's right and what's wrong. And then we have this critical level of trying to aim to maximize our happiness. But the problem, one thing I'd like clarification on is it seems that the very thing that we're trying to maximize here is defined in terms of that second level, the intuitive level systems.
Same word about what you mean by that what you're trying to maximize as happiness is defined by the intuitive level. Do you mean like our common sense conception of what makes a person happy or an animal happy may be formed without us being conscious of it? We sort of inherit it like a common sense notion.
What happiness is and stuff.
Okay. Oh, okay. So then I take it what you're pointing to is that there can be a kind of perverting influence of common sense views about what the nature of happiness is for a human and for various species of non-human animals. So that if you were born into a culture where you think that, well, pigs, are insentient or very nearly, and, they don't feel much, something like that, and you absorb that from the common sense of your generation, when you explicitly think like a utilitarian about how to modify the laws and professional ethics and common morality, you're going to have an incorrect conception of the happiness of the animals that are affected that's going to feed into your calculations about how to change the laws. Is that the point you were making?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, to agree for sure.
Okay, that's a problem. And there's no antidote for that other than saying we as a society going forward should dedicate ourselves to trying to uncover misapprehensions of how our treatment of animals affects their well-being over time. You can't make that vanish with a federal grant, in 10 years, but a sincere society of utilitarians could commit themselves to doing what they can along the way to fund research that could eliminate that perverting influence of common sense that you pointed to.
Excuse me, I think it's time to close the session and the discussion, but I would like to invite you to talk to Gary and join us for coffee and treats in the Animal Bioscience department in room 230. And I would like to thank you once more for your excellent talk and for your engagement.
Thank you for having me.